Let's say I married John Boehner. Right now, my ID says my full name, Rachel Ann Maddow. The picture looks nothing like that. Thanks, you guys, for dressing it up. But if I was going to become not Rachel Ann Maddow, but rather Rachel Ann Boehner, it's pronounced Boehner, the state of Texas for a long time, if I lived in Texas and that's where I was marrying my John, the state of Texas would have required me to change the name on my ID to effectively declare Maddow to be my new middle name instead of Ann. These days, in most places, you have a choice as to whether or not you want to do that. But in Texas, by law, well into the 20th century, well into the time that a lot of our moms were getting married, the law required me on my official Texas state ID to be Rachel Maddow Boehner. That was just the way you had to do it. And under Texas law, as of this week, that would mean that I would not be allowed to vote there. If I'm registered under the name Rachel Ann Maddow or just Rachel Boehner, that would not exactly match what was on my ID, because my ID, by law, had to say Rachel Maddow Boehner. And therefore, under the brand new Texas voter ID law that has just gone into effect for the first time this week, as early voting starts for the November elections this year in Texas, women in Texas who have never done anything weirder under Texas state law than get married and get the married lady ID that Texas required them to get, women who have done nothing weirder than that in their lives are finding that for the first time in their lives, they are being blocked from voting because of this new Texas voting law. Texas's new voting law makes you show documentation in order to vote that you never had to show before. And it is such a strict law that before it went into effect this week, there had been worries that this married woman maiden name issue was maybe going to block women from being able to vote or force them onto provisional ballots all across the state. Just yesterday, the Texas Tribune posted a survey piece on people worrying about this issue and ultimately concluded, don't worry. They quoted a spokesperson from the Texas Secretary of State's office reassuring people that there was really nothing to worry about. So you see the headline there. Could name change spur voter ID issue? Officials say no. That came out yesterday in Texas. By last night, this was the local news in Corpus Christi.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Gazen. Katya is off this evening. At the top, the state's new voter ID law. It is meant to prevent voter fraud, but it may be causing some delays at your neighborhood polling place, especially if the name on your driver's license differs from the name on your voter registration card, even a little bit. Nueces County election officials say it's often a problem for women who use maiden names or hyphenated names. Rudy Trevino tells us the problem came to light yesterday when a local district judge had trouble casting a ballot. The story is first at 6.
What I have used for voter registration and for identification for the last 52 years was not sufficient yesterday when I went to vote.
117th District Court Judge Sandra Watts has voted in every election for the last 49 years. The name on her driver's license has remained the same for 52 years, and the address on her voter registration card or driver's license hasn't changed in more than 2 decades. So imagine, to her surprise, when she was told by voting officials she'd have to sign a voter's affidavit affirming she was who she said she was.
Someone looked at that and said, well, they're not the same.
The difference? On the driver's license, Judge Watt's maiden name is her middle name. On her voter registration, it's her actual middle name. That was enough under the new stricter voter fraud law to send up a red flag.
This is the first time I've ever had a problem voting. I don't think most women know that this is going to create a problem, that their maiden name is on their driver's license, which was mandated in 1964 when I got married, and this. And so why would I want to use a provisional ballot when I've been voting regular ballot for the last 49 years?
While on the issue of voter fraud, we spoke with District Attorney Mark Skirka about the prevalence of this crime in Nueces County.
I have never seen an issue of that in Nueces County in all the years I've been here.
In Nueces County, Texas, I have never seen an issue of voter fraud in Nueces County in all the years I've been here, says the local DA. The voter fraud, not really a problem in that county where that's happening anyway. Also, in Texas broadly, voter fraud is not really a problem. In Texas, over the last 13 years, tens of millions of votes have been cast in that state. Tens of millions. And the grand total of documented instances of somebody showing up at the polls and pretending to be somebody else in Texas is one. Literally one, not 1%, one guy. One guy for the whole state over 13 years. But that one guy is apparently justification enough to change state law in Texas to make it so people like this lifelong Texan, this judge who's been voting in the state for 49 years, now has a huge hassle trying to vote in the state if she is allowed to vote at all. There are an estimated 1.4 million voters in Texas who are eligible voters who do not have the kind of documentation you're now required to show in order to cast a vote in that state. And that doesn't even count the people who do supposedly have the right documentation. They do have the right kind of ID, like that judge. But the ID doesn't match in exactly the way it has to match now for you to be allowed to vote anymore. And this is all coming into focus in Texas this week because early voting has just started in the Texas November elections. I have to say there are precisely zero high stakes, big publicity, super motivating statewide issues on the ballot in this election in Texas this year. This is a sleepy election. It's a whole bunch of constitutional amendments about things like the number of days that aircraft parts are exempt from ad valorem taxes. Something about reverse mortgages that I'm sure is very important. Nobody's expecting massive turnout for elections on these issues right now in Texas, and for people to vote on whether there's a hospital board district in Hidalgo County, a few little sprinkling of municipal elections happening in various places around the state. This is going to be a very low turnout election in Texas this year. You can track the voter turnout already and see that in some precincts, the total numbers of voters so far is like 13 or 26. So the problems that people are having voting right now under the new strict Texas voter ID laws, these problems are quiet little problems happening here and there in a very, very low volume election. But what's going to happen, say, next year? What's going to happen in the next big, hot Texas election, like, say, the Wendy Davis for governor election, or for that matter, the next presidential election? Of the, at minimum, 1.4 million Texans who right now do not have the right kind of ID to be allowed to vote anymore, even though they could vote in the past. Texas Republicans have said, you know what, nobody should worry about whether or not those people are going to be able to cast their ballots, because they will make sure, the Republican-controlled state government of Texas will make sure that everybody who's an eligible voter but who doesn't have an ID, everybody will get one. They started what they described as statewide efforts to get everybody an ID starting in June. Since then, of the 1.4 million Texas voters who are eligible to vote but who do not have ID, of the 1.4 million, the number of people who have gotten the ID under the new system from the state government so they can vote is 50. That, according to the state of Texas, is the count as of this evening. We called them and asked. 50 people out of 1.4 million. If you want to do the math on what percentage of the problem is solved already, let me help you out. That means there are 2 zeros even after the decimal point before you get to start putting together other integers. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths of a percent. Why Texas Republicans wanted to change the law about voting is anybody's guess. It seems kind of obvious. But the reason they were able to change the law about voting is because of the United States Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court this summer gutted the Voting Rights Act, Texas was thereby freed from the burden of having to pre-clear changes in Texas election law with the federal Justice Department to make sure that those changes were not going to have a racially discriminatory effect. Texas Republicans had wanted to pass this voter ID law forever, but the Justice Department wouldn't clear them to do it because of its racially discriminatory effect. Now that the Voting Rights Act is gutted, though, Texas gets to go ahead with what was too obviously discriminatory for them to get away with in the past, but now they can get away with, at least for the time being. The Justice Department is now suing to try to stop them after the fact, anyway, even though they couldn't stop them from putting it into effect in the first place. Meanwhile, the same thing is underway in North Carolina, where the gutting of the Voting Rights Act freed Republicans in that state to pursue their own version of not just a voter ID bill, but a broad-based crackdown on what the Advancement Project has described as basically all the ways that African Americans in North Carolina have gotten used to voting. In North Carolina, the Republicans there have narrowed the window for early voting. They're putting new restrictions on voter registration drives. They're making it much harder for students to vote. They're ending same-day registration during the early voting period. They're making it easier for vigilante vigilante poll watchers who want to challenge eligible voters. They're even putting specific new limits on voting on Sundays, which nobody has even tried to link to some phantom voter fraud threat. But Sundays do tend to be when black churches like to carpool their congregations to all go vote. The Justice Department is also challenging the North Carolina law. They were never able to go ahead with this before the Voting Rights Act got gutted by the Supreme Court. But once it did, they've gone ahead. The Justice Department is challenging it after the fact. And on the same day that that judge in Texas was getting turned away from the polls because heaven forbid she once got married, on that same day, North Carolina Republicans started to file their legal defense to all the lawsuits that they're facing challenging their new voter suppression law. And on that same day, in North Carolina, as the state Republican Party was starting its defense of this law, which is expected to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of African-American voters in North Carolina, on that same day, the Republican Party in North Carolina opened up a new North Carolina Office of African American Outreach to try to convince African Americans in North Carolina that if they do vote, they really ought to be voting for the Republican Party. That's turning out to be a really big if. If you can vote, think about. The influential Reagan-appointed conservative judge Richard Posner, who wrote the first major federal court ruling okaying strict voter ID laws, he said in an interview recently for the first time that he regrets that opinion. He says he did not realize when he wrote that landmark decision okaying voter ID laws that the effect of them could be so racially discriminatory. And that is nice to know at this point, but it is not Judge Posner's regret that stands as legal and political precedent. It is his ruling, even if he now says that ruling was wrong. The Democratic Party today announced a new national director of voter protection to work on these issues across the country. But in the meantime, these issues are happening at the very local level. Texas elections, for example, are underway with this new draconian and in some cases bewildering set of rules. And for now, at least, it's being left to local officials operating precinct by precinct, town by town, county by county, try to figure out how to make this new law work and how far they're going to have to try to stretch this law and try to work around it and try to work through it to let people who have been voting for years keep voting like they are used to doing.